So since we last looked at China, the Song dynasty had been ruling with kind of a very loose grip on their population. The increasing international demand for Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain led merchants to hold the real power in the state, introducing, large multiple-mast ships called junks for long-distance voyages and building massive factories employing assembly line workers. So while merchants really prospered and ruled during the Song period, the central authority, the royal family, became very unstable and finally fell to Genghis Khan in the mid-1200s. And so Genghis Khan had to the north previously united the Mongols with the Tartars, Turks, and other nomads of Central Asia, and by adding now northern China, had come to rule the largest territory yet to be ruled by a single regime in history. His sons would expand his empire further into southern China, Central Asia, Persia, and even into Turkey and Russia before splitting into Khanate states under his grandsons. And so Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, who took rule of China and started the Yuan dynasty, ruled the largest state called the Empire of the Great Khan, this easternmost largest state. And he owed really his successful command of the nation to gunpowder, this relatively new invention by the Song dynasty. And he planned his new capital to rule all of China at Khan Balik, literally translated to Khan's city, which would become eventually the city of Beijing. So let's zoom into Khan Balik and look at how the Mongols organized their ruling capital in China. So as originally a Mongolian nomad, Kublai sought to win over his Chinese subjects by adhering to their customs. So his architect planned Khan Balik as a literal reproduction of the Wangchang diagram, with a grid of 3 north-south streets and 3 east-west streets, with a large space, of course, for the palace in the center. And it apparently had an informal pleasure lake that passed through the center, skirting the imperial palace. And so Khan Balik grew into a large, multi-ethnic metropolis covering twice the space of ancient Rome. The Mongols here tolerated all religions, so inside these walls you would find Nestorian churches, mosques, Buddhist temples, and Buddhist pagodas. Yet at the same time, much of Kublai's Mongol army was said to still have lived in yurts within and without the city walls. But the Yuan dynasty began to falter after Kublai Khan's death in 1294. Long story short, his Chinese and Mongolian quarters had divided interests, and by the 1300s he had lost all control as a result of rebellions and the devastation wrought by the Black Plague or the Black Death. And so Khan Balik fell really without resistance in 1366 to the founder of the next dynasty, Ming Taizu, who destroyed the city. The first Ming emperor shunned Khan Balik and kept his capital in the southern city of Nanjing. The next important ruler, Chenzu, decided to return to Kublai City because he had won his throne in 1402 by ousting the designated heir and wanted to distance himself, from his hostile relatives in the south. And so he renamed Khan Balik Beijing, which we still call it today, which meant northern capital, and this allowed him to, make this clean start. And so Chenzu constructed Beijing over the remnants of Kublai's abandoned capital. And so at the center of Beijing, the Forbidden City, begun by this Emperor Chenzu in 1402, really served as the exclusive district of the emperor, accessible only to him, his family, and his court officials. It fit into the outline of Kublai's earlier palace and was surrounded by a massive moat. Its major palaces line up along a central axis in strict symmetry, while the perimeter hosted hundreds of major buildings for members of the court. Meanwhile, the intensely massive negative spaces surrounding these relatively small palaces were meant to instill a sense of awe. So the outer court, the largest entrance courtyard after one passed through these two guarded gates, was this vast assembly space planned as sort of a site where thousands of courtiers could appear on ritual occasions like grand coronations, imperial birthdays, and New Year's celebrations. They could come all throughout the Empire of China to greet the emperor here. They could go no further into the imperial palace though. The first structure here, the Hall of Supreme Harmony, was the largest wooden structure in China. This housed the most public ceremonies in which the emperor appeared to his courtiers. Meanwhile, behind it was the Hall of Middle Harmony, perfectly square in plan where, the emperor held his throne room. Only courtiers and governors with official business could petition the emperor here. Finally, the third hall, the Hall of Preserving Harmony, was a site for more minor festivals where the emperor permitted only his favorite courtiers. And these double-eaved, concave, upturned roofs indicated high status and were only to be used in the imperial city, nowhere else around China. They were held up by the support of branch-like wooden dugong brackets resting on pillars which stood all throughout the interior, allowing the thin walls to bear, no weight, allowing for mass amounts of stained glass and paper windows. And they painted all of these walls in this deep red plaster and gave the roofs golden cup tiles. Again, these were only meant for the imperial city. No one else could paint their houses in this color or decorate their roofs with these golden cup tiles. And these tiny terracotta fixtures lining the crest of the roofs, these lions, dragons, and men riding roosters, were all meant to drive away evil spiritually, ritually from these halls. And I said earlier, these grand open spaces between the palaces kind of served as an imposing feature of awe, but they also, ensured these buildings, a new fireproof permanence not known in other Chinese capitals. Further into the Forbidden City, the inner court was meant as the imperial residence where the emperor, the empress, and their family would live, which really repeated the outer court at half scale. The front hall here was reserved for the emperor to live in, and the rear for the empress. Between the two stood the Hall of Union, this building encouraging royal intercourse. But aside from the emperor's duty to produce an heir in the Hall of Union, the emperor had more than 100 concubines by the 1500s who lived in the dense courts to either side of the inner court. It was in these courtyards that concubines practiced music, art, and literature in the company of maids to entertain the emperor when he was in their company. So families often groomed their daughters for the role from childhood because you had to audition to be a concubine, serving someone as high up as the emperor. They forced these concubines to have bound feet, which made them useless for any kind of labor. Meanwhile, court eunuchs administered the entire Forbidden City. These were castrated men presumed to have no lust for the imperial concubines, and since they were incapable of having children, they would not be tempted to seize power and start a dynasty. They were very well trusted by the imperial family, and they mostly lived in barrack-like buildings on the edge of the compound. The lower-ranking ones often guarded the concubines, did the heavy labor, and kept order within the Forbidden City during ceremonies, but the high-ranking ones ran the very day-to-day itinerary of the emperor and the empress. They also administered the central government and even served as spies for the emperor. By the 20th century, there were about 2,000 eunuchs working in the Forbidden City. But the most important group running the government outside of the imperial city by far were the scholar officials. So ambitious families trained their boys to spend long years studying classical Chinese philosophies and histories, preparing for a civil service exam, which, if they passed, granted them a tenured position in the empire's bureaucracy. And so the government usually installed these scholar officials, as they were called, far from their homes to avoid conflicts of interest, but thousands served the emperor in Beijing. Because the work of scholar officials was so exacting though, they often retired after only a decade. They lived with their families just outside the Forbidden City in these very handsome narrow brick Sichuan courtyard houses with a protective perimeter wall that represented the Forbidden City on a sort of smaller scale. And all of these buildings, not belonging to the emperor, were uniformly gray with gray roof tiles, creating this stark contrast to the gold and red of the Forbidden City. The cities of China outside the capital at Beijing, though, typically were denser but less rigid and more subject to change. One of these better preserved cities from this time is Suzhou, which reached its prime really in the 1500s and 1600s during the Ming Dynasty. So Suzhou in the 1400s essentially had a population of around 500,000, twice as large though as any European city at the time. And it actually developed this subtle counterculture to the capital, since the imperial government did not allow other cities to develop political autonomy. Rather than, making direct attacks on the central government, the city's elites showed their discontent by making their city the antithesis of Beijing. So instead of relying on a grand central axis like most cities do, its streets were winding, full of detours, and 20 canals crisscrossing each other like a Chinese Venice. And in the place of a tyrant's palace, there were dozens of delicate gardens, private and public, each designed by a different, usually wealthy patron. Usually they were designed by retired scholar officials or else rich local merchants, and stocked with small lakes, shady pavilions, and fantastic eroded rocks to contemplate. These retired Chinese men often adopted Taoism, this go-with-the-flow religion, in their old age, and cultivated these gardens in retirement. So masses of scholar officials came to retire here after they had served very arduously the government in Beijing. And these gardens were often named after Chinese philosophical ideas or else simple puns. This net-mastered garden here, this private walled and enclosure, was designed so that you could really leave any room in the estate and explore the grounds on 3 different paths, which kind of encouraged you to make unnecessary turns and slow down to appreciate the beauty. Again, the complete antithesis of the stressful, high-energy, orthogonal Beijing. This comes from the Taoist idea that one should develop an interest in walking without a destination, but to appreciate each moment. And so these garden designers often set up all throughout their gardens these winding paths, these useless pavilions for surveying the scenery, these kind of zigzag bridges that force you to slow down, and these tiny tea houses for briefly stopping to entertain their friends. This was all, at the end of the day, a subtle statement of disaffection with the Ming Dynasty and their iron grip on the country through micromanaging laws, exacting taxes, and discouraging trade. Here in the Ming Dynasty, actually all foreign trade was to be conducted by official tribute missions handled by representatives of the Ming Empire and its vassal states. So the charm of these gardens proved so powerful that in 1769, the emperor at the time, on abdicating his throne, even added his own Suzhou-style garden behind the inner court of the Forbidden City. And probably, I'm assuming, all of a sudden making it sort of uncool for a while. Our second discussion in this class will be on the fall of the Christian Byzantine Empire and the rise of the Muslim Ottoman Empire in its place, with their very distinct architecture, really, combining Islamic and Byzantine construction to create some of the world's most dazzling monuments that endure today. So the Ottoman Turks were originally this large nomadic warmongering tribe that kind of descended from Central Asia into Turkey. First, serving as mercenaries in the service of the Seljuks. And naturally, by the 900s, most of these Ottoman tribes had converted to the religion of their employers, which was Islam. By the 1200s, they amassed enough numbers and riches to carve out a small state in western Turkey, which was easy pickings because it had recently been absolutely devastated by the raids of Genghis Khan's generals. By the 1300s, they absorbed most of Turkey from the Byzantines, and by 1326, they established themselves in the small town of Bursa as their capital. By the end of the 1300s, the Ottomans had managed to take for themselves much of the Balkans, hemming the Byzantines in and surrounding Constantinople. And during the next half-century, they threatened and engulfed Constantinople itself, which eventually fell in 1453, taking it as their new capital and ending swiftly the Byzantine Empire. At this point, they considered themselves the God-given heirs to the Roman Empire. They considered it their mission to take up the baton of reviving the Roman Empire from the Byzantines, only now under the true faith of Islam. They would, by 1566, mostly succeed in their mission, holding the entire western half of the Mediterranean and Mesopotamia under their sway, as well as Mecca and almost all of North Africa. So as you can imagine, Ottoman architects were very inspired by the Byzantine architecture they saw of Turkey and Greece, often preferring to blend the vaulted domes and masonry of Byzantine churches with the domes of Seljuk tombs for their mosques. And so the Orhan Gazi Mosque, built in Bursa, their first capital, by the son of the founder of the Ottoman dynasty, is a great example to look at for these early Ottoman mosques. It served as the exclusive mosque for the Sultan and his court. And so, early Ottoman mosques, as exemplified here, often took a sort of T-shape, a corruption of the Byzantine Greek cross church, with a front porch made of pointed arches. And the masonry here really resembled Byzantine church walls with these kind of alternating bands of brick and limestone. Here, one would purify oneself in an octagonal fountain house, usually in a garden just outside the porch and attached to a minaret. Inside though, these four Byzantine-style hemispherical domes covered an axial prayer hall leading to the mihrab in the front. And this elevated space nearest the mihrab served the caliph's closest courtiers, as in other mosques before. And so this T-shaped mosque reappeared in many other mosques in Bursa. For example, the Green Mosque here, built for another early sultan of the Ottomans, was clad in this beautifully rendered green marble and shows Ottoman wealth and power growing fast. The interior seems like a palace with decorative makarnas holding squinched Byzantine and Mamluk domes. A foyer and stairs actually led to a second level above the porch where the sultan looked down on his court during his prayers, raising him even higher than the Orhan Gazi Mosque. This was, you can imagine, inspired by the Byzantine and European Westwork towers, which were reviewed, a few lectures ago, where, if you can remember, Christian royalty traditionally sat during their service. Also, like Christian churches though, the Ottomans brought in stained glass. The upper clerestory windows here were actually glazed with green and blue glass, which brought this beautiful colored light in. And the Green Mosque here actually belonged to a whole charitable compound introduced by the Ottomans during the 1300s called the Imaret. So Imarets were essentially a type of charitable compound aimed to kind of soften citizens to this new Ottoman rule, which usually included a mosque, a tomb of the donor, a religious college, a public bath, and a public soup kitchen. And so these complexes, built by the Ottoman aristocracy as a show of wealth, really pushed the expression of, Muslim benevolence to win over the largely then Christian populace. And so it was through, these good works of welfare, through these imarets, through building these imarets, that they also promoted Islam. And as the practice evolved, imarets from humble to grand became the centers of neighborhoods, the equivalent of the town square before the cathedral in the Christian world. And so each Ottoman sultan, by tradition, started to create the grandest imarets he could during his reign, along with a plan to finance and administer it in perpetuity, paid for by giving the foundation its own revenue-producing estates. So then these also functioned much like Christian monasteries in that they were, a way for the aristocracy to show their wealth, and were met as these eternal self-supporting foundations taken out of an aristocrat's holding as sort of a pious, selfless act toward the citizens. The Grand Mosque of Bursa, the biggest mosque in Bursa, was the first mosque to differ from this classical T-shaped Ottoman mosque. It followed the hypostyle hall model used in much of the rest of the Islamic world, but seated shallow hemispherical domes over each bay. And so after this, the square bay with a rounded dome on top became really the standard unit for Ottoman architecture. So not just mosques, but palaces, hospitals, schools, baths, and markets all took on this basic building block as a sign that something is state-sanctioned Ottoman architecture. So the Silk Market in Bursa here, for example, was built as a rectangular court with 2 levels of arcades, very much, evoking a Roman form. But of course, in the classical Ottoman style, the upper level of the arcades each had domes over each bay. And so these, symmetrically organized public buildings, long unseen in medieval Turkey and Greece, really conveyed the ideas of a new, efficient political order to replace the Byzantines on par again with the distant and ancient Roman Empire. Now, briefly, before looking at the Ottoman capital moving from Bursa to Constantinople, let's look more in depth at their conquest. So by the 1300s, before the Ottoman invasion of Constantinople, the city had kind of dwindled to around 50,000 inhabitants. And when in 1453, after a 52-day siege, Constantinople succumbed to the Ottomans, helped by gunpowder, the Sultan at the time, Mehmed II, became known as Fatih, or the Conqueror, for the rest of his life. And so directly after conquering the city, Fatih declared a war pardon for non-Muslims to quickly repopulate Constantinople, and he allowed the Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and Italians living there to form distinct districts within the walls governed by their own laws to persuade them from leaving. And Ottoman officials for a time continued to call the city Constantinople, but soon a new name took hold. Many within the new empire gave it the name Istanbul. This was a contraction of the Greek phrase, the city within the walls, because it was simply the largest city around with the largest walls around. To simulate trade in his newly conquered city, Fatih founded a massive, beautiful market in the center of Istanbul using the classical units of Ottoman architecture, square bays and round domes. Its center had 15 bays capped with round lead-plated domes, but the space was cleared around with room for 3,000 shops. This center building was a fortified and guarded compound for luxury goods, which stood slightly taller than the rest of the shops around it. And so through encouraging trade, Istanbul's population doubled in just 2 decades, and by the end of the 1500s, it had returned to over 500,000, making it again the largest city in Europe. Sultan Fatih understandably thought that the Church of the Hagia Sophia was the great prize and symbol of Constantinople. Fatih is even reported to have taken the sword to one of his soldiers who tried to pry up one of the paving slabs of the marble floor during the siege. And so when Mehmed and his entourage entered the church, he ordered that it be converted into a mosque immediately. However, in defiance, the church's priests and religious personnel continued to perform Christian rites, prayers, and ceremonies until they were compelled to stop by the invaders. As described by Western visitors before 1453, the church was in a dilapidated state, with several of its doors fallen from their hinges. And so Mehmed II ordered the first renovation of the building in centuries. He ordered the construction of a minaret, and 3 more were added during the 1500s. He also built a mihrab into the eastern apse, slightly askew from the main axis to point directly to Mecca. Other than taking down the cross on the roof, the Hagia Sophia sat largely unchanged during the Fatih's reign. It wasn't until the early 1500s that the Christian mosaics were covered in whitewash and plaster, but were not removed until many were in the 1930s under the Turkish Republic. And so, very inspired by the form of the Hagia Sophia, Fatih commissioned his court architect Atik Sinan to build a new mosque in 1463 with his tomb behind the mihrab. And so this new mosque and tomb actually replaced the very famous Apostolion, Constantine's burial church, which we've referenced so much in this class as examples for other works. This was, a very deliberate move of a great political power. Sultan Fatih would replace the cult of Constantine in the city with his own. And very eager he was to acquire the equivalent of Constantine's power that he began using the title Kaiser-i-Rum, or Caesar of Rome. And the new mosque's dome was only a few meters less than the Hagia Sophia's. Beneath it, a semi-dome stepped down to the north, east, and south, capped with 3 smaller domes to the north and south, each radiating with windows like the Hagia Sophia. Inside, all the arches which held up the domes were pointed oblong arches, making a break from the rounded Byzantine arches in the city. Outside, 2 pencil minarets stood from the corners of the mosque, and a forecourt with the same area as the interior was topped with small domes on each bay of the court's arcades, and ancient Roman columns supported pointed arches of red and white block masonry. In the cemetery garden behind the mosque, Fatih built an octagonal tomb in, of course, the fashion of Roman imperial mausoleums. And the entire mosque complex sat at the center of a massive square plaza cleared from the center of the city. On the north and south sides stood 8 religious colleges, and beyond these stood hospitals, thermal baths, stables, kitchens, hospices, and soup kitchens, making this not just a mosque but the biggest minaret in the Ottoman world. The kitchens prepared meals for over 1,000 people per day, and the Fatih intended this minaret as a gift to the people, intended to demonstrate Ottoman peace and prosperity in the city. A few years after the Ottomans took Constantinople, Fatih decided to move his palace from the traditional Byzantine palaces in the center of the city to the extreme tip of the peninsula. And so the resulting complex offered this more secluded residence with fortified walls for the Fatih's protection and unique specifications. The whole complex was organized on this succession of 3 courts that were added and renovated throughout the 1500s and 1600s. Within the first gate, the imperial hierarchy gathered for formal ceremonies, much like in the Forbidden City in China. And to the left was the most important administrative center of the Ottoman Empire, the Diwan, or council hall, containing the royal palace and offices. This was a succession of domed halls around courtyards for official diplomatic meetings with the Sultan, and further in, daily administrative offices for the chief administrators of the empire. And directly behind this Diwan was the harem. This was an intricate collection of small courts and chambers on 3 levels that served as the residence of the Sultan's concubines. And this harem was made up of mostly abducted child female slaves from as far away as Italy, Hungary, and Africa, raised in the old Byzantine palace, educated in Turkish, converted to Islam, and then added to the harem as adults. The aim was to create a small society of obedient, well-instructed, foreign-born women to entertain the Sultan. During the 1500s, the harem housed as many as 150 women, guarded mostly by black Ethiopian slaves bought from the west coast of Africa. The Sultan's favorite concubines were awarded small but lavish apartments, while the lesser ones lived in a crowded dormitory, sleeping 10 to a couch. And if impregnated, a concubine was moved back to the old Byzantine palace, where at least another 1,500 women were being groomed for service. And if she gave birth to a son who was acknowledged by the Sultan, the court sent the concubine and her child to a province of the empire, where he was educated as a prince and military leader, and eventually raised to governor when he came of age. Meanwhile, enslaved boys abducted from the empire's campaigns lived in the last court of Tokapi. This was called the Court of the Male Pages, and its purpose was to house a school for government. Its purpose was, to create a society of obedient, well-instructed, foreign-born men to run the top positions in the Ottoman government. The courtyard was arranged like a monastery cloister, with each side carrying a differing style of arcade and roof type as a nod to the cosmopolitan origins of the slave boys. The courtyard and its classrooms followed these perfect orthogonal alignments, but a mosque for the slave boys jutted off kilter aimed toward Mecca. Most of the surrounding halls of the court served as dormitories and classrooms for as many as 500 slave boys who would eventually enter the Ottoman government. They underwent about 14 years of training, disciplined by the court eunuchs. And the rules required absolute silence outside of class time, forcing the boys to communicate using sign language. And so the boys of merit here became the empire's elite class of viziers or governors, and often women of the harem or daughters of the emperor were given to them as wives. And so the Fatih's system of, training these obedient slave boys in a greater number than his own sons produced this loyal governing class, much less likely to come to succession conflicts than in typical hereditary aristocracies. Sinan, the greatest and most famous architect of the Ottoman Renaissance, came from this mass of young slaves educated at the court of pages. He actually fought as a janissary, or in the Sultan's household troops as the Sultan's bodyguard, and he later went on to become, as I said, the greatest and most famous architect of the Ottoman Empire, and his works really still represent the height of the empire in stone to posterity. He soon distinguished himself as a gifted military engineer, designing aqueducts, impossible-looking mosques, and imarets on the frontiers of the empire. He was, responsible for over 300 projects across the empire, and at about the age of 50, he was appointed as chief royal architect by Sultan Suleiman I, applying, the technical skills he had required in the army to the creation of fine mosques and civic structures of all kinds. And so Sinan's first work for Suleiman was this Sadze Mosque, or Prince's Mosque, dedicated to the Sultan's heir, in which he attempted to surpass the Hagia Sophia, raising the dome even higher and wider. To do this, Sinan majorly stilted the dome from the base of the mosque, supported its outward thrust with 8 flying buttresses, and surrounded it with 4 semi-domes and 4 smaller domes in the corners. Now with the buttresses here, he's obviously becoming inspired by Gothic Europe, so he's drawing from a wide area, a wide geographic range of sources. At the height of his power, Suleiman I commissioned Sinan to build his own royal mosque apart from the Hagia Sophia. And so, similar to the design of the Prince's Mosque, Sinan supported the dome with these flying buttresses and a pyramidal massing of half domes, but determined to, make the dome ever higher and wider than the last, he ran into a problem. It was just far too heavy for the already massively thick piers beneath to support without buckling outward. And so to solve this, without needing to thicken or buttress the piers on the inside, Sinan added these 4 colossal solid stone towers on top of the piers, this genius feat of engineering. And so, like Gothic pinnacles, these towers served as counterweights over the piers that carried the weight of the dome. So what I mean by this is, because of the direct downward weight on the piers, they were prevented from bowing outward or buckling. So instead of making the piers thicker underneath the dome, he put more weight on top of the piers to let gravity compress and strengthen them. And because these piers were so sturdy, Sinan was able to, ditch the half domes on the north and south sides, opening up the walls beneath the arches to be punctured by 3 rows of windows. Meanwhile, the pencil minarets were a feat of their own. They were the tallest in all of Islamdom, the inner ones with 3 whole balconies and the outer with 2. And this mosque had an minaret as well surrounding it, and it occupied the true center of Istanbul, and so became the enduring symbol of the Ottoman Empire. And so 7 religious colleges surrounded this mosque, and it became the prime center of learning for all of Islamdom. And of course, behind the dome of the mosque, in classic Ottoman tradition for royal mosques, Sinan built the Sultan's tomb and that of his wife as these octagonal domed Roman mausoleums, because again, the Ottomans are trying to cast themselves as the inheritors of the Roman Empire. And I just want to quickly finish with this quote from Sinan, where he sort of captures the pride the Ottomans found in their architecture at this time. So he says, architects in Christian countries may rank themselves above Muslims in technical skills, owing to the failure of the latter to achieve anything approaching the dome of the Hagia Sophia. This assertion of insurmountable difficulty has wounded the author of these writings. However, with God's help and the Sultan's mercy, I have succeeded in building a dome for Sultan Suleiman. Next, we're going to talk about Papal Rome, but this is really a lecture on the continuation of the Renaissance in Rome. So I think it's best to start with a sort of visualization of the really sorry state of Rome at the beginning of the Renaissance, while, for example, Florence was absolutely flourishing. So over the medieval centuries, Rome had really dissolved into a shadow of its former self. The Roman Forum had reverted to essentially a grass-covered cattle market, and even the popes abandoned Rome for much of the 1300s to live in Avignon, France. But their consistent return to Rome during the first half of the 1400s really opened the way for the Papal Restoration and for the Renaissance to really enter Rome itself. And so this Renaissance, as I said last class, this rebirth of classical culture, which first sprouted up in northern Italy, had a very late start in Rome, but migrated there with the popes, who had the greatest hand in, rebirthing this city as the magnificent capital of the Papal States. And so the popes, as you can imagine, returned to a very languishing St. Peter's Basilica built by Constantine. And soon, during the late 1400s, when the Papal States, stretched from Milan to Naples, really having this second wind, its basilica and forecourt began to seem much too small and modest to symbolize their imperial ambitions. So there began to be talk about rebuilding St. Peter's Basilica. So the first stirrings of this happened during the late 1490s when Pope Alexander VI had ruled the Papal States and involved himself in the Italian Wars on the side of Cesare Borgia, who attempted to unify Italy under a single ruler. And this Pope Alexander VI actually commissioned the Via Alessandria, this road, this straight monumental avenue that plowed 800 meters west of St. Peter's, requiring significant demolitions. It would, provide a very obvious route for pilgrims, it would provide a site for papal processions, but most importantly, it would serve as a triumphal route for Cesare's return from his victories. And doesn't this just sound like ancient Rome to a T? The Pope, viewing himself as the inheritor of the Emperor of Rome, constructing this processional avenue for his favorite general to march down after his victories. So, even this road, although it had no distinct classical architecture yet, was a major symbol of the Renaissance, the rebirth of classical values. And this Via Alessandria would be the site out from which the Renaissance spawned in Rome. And so it served as a site for the city's newest classical palaces. At the street's midpoint, one of the Pope's closest friends began work on a palace to celebrate his recent appointment as a cardinal. And cardinals, if you're not aware, are princes of the church essentially appointed by the Pope. They're essentially candidates for future popes. And so the Palazzo Castellisi, as it was called, differed from the previous cardinals' palaces built in Rome, which were these essentially fortified towers with crenellations, very characteristic of the other medieval northern Italian cities which we've looked at in the past. But this new cardinal's palace offered the model of elegance for the rest of the street. It embodied, a Florentine ideal of beauty, like the Medici palaces, with a central courtyard like a Roman domus, and on the outside, this smooth ashlar rustication at the base, paired with Corinthian plasters on the upper 2 stories and a projecting cornice. You'll remember this from last class. But to make this distinctly Roman, the pilasters, the round-headed windows, and the cornices you'll notice imitate details found on the Colosseum located in Rome, and thus made something Florence-inspired more Roman in character. And the Palazzo Cancelleria, begun by another cardinal, followed suit. By 1501, the soon-to-be famous architect Donato Bramante distinguished himself in designing the Palazzo Caprini. His unique style would, set the precedent for Rome's most public projects, and eventually he would be commissioned to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica itself. In contrast to the previous Renaissance palaces, it had much greater plasticity, much more depth, generating light and shade. It would set the precedent for the rest of the papal palaces. It carried this heavy rustication at the base of a 5-bay facade arched like a Roman aqueduct, allowing the placement of 2 small shops either side of the central portal, the central entrance. But on the second level, Bramante articulated the second story with pairs of Doric half columns holding up a correct Doric frieze. And then he set the windows in these temple-like aedicules, each with a balustrade at the base and a triangular pediment at the top. So as this kind of foreshadowing of his design of new St. Peter's Basilica, Bramante was commissioned to build first this small shrine in the cloister of the monastery of St. Peter near the Vatican City. This was, the alleged site of St. Peter's upside-down crucifixion. And this shrine he built really resembled an ancient round tholos-type temple, or a Roman temple in the round. It had these Doric columns that carried this typical Doric entablature balcony with sculpted metopes depicting the symbols of St. Peter, the keys of heaven, among others. But Bramante diverged from the ancients by placing a balustrade above the entablature and adding a very tall drum beneath the dome. And these ideas would have a lasting impact on Italian church design, let alone the future of St. Peter's Basilica. The plan, with niches scooped out from the exterior, balustrades, and these freestanding columns, broke, this classical skin that the Renaissance architects had until now been wont to put on their square palaces and medieval-shaped churches. And so Bramante here started this taste for plasticity, a building's 3-dimensional or sculptural presence. After Bramante, Renaissance architects more and more started to, even more than the ancients had, do everything they could to play with light and 3-dimensionality on their works. So finally, in 1506, Bramante's fame earned him the most important commission of the century. Pope Julius II hired him to demolish and rebuild St. Peter's Basilica. Now, the displacement of the old church by the new was really inspired by the distant Mehmed II, emperor of the Ottoman Empire, replacing Constantine's Apostolion with his Fatih Mosque, if you'll remember from earlier in this lecture. The Catholic world, needed to show up this act of modernity. And so Pope Julius basically said to Bramante, "Make me the biggest, most magnificent church in all of Christendom." And Bramante understood that this church had to be distinct from most other churches in Italy, most all, borrowing from the Roman basilica plan set forth by Constantine. But to be a proper mausoleum for St. Paul, like the mausoleum of a Roman emperor, it should be centrally planned with his tomb in the center. So Bramante, drawing from antiquity, hopes to pitch a great hemispherical dome like that of the Pantheon on top of the grand coffered vaults seen in the Basilica of Maxentius and more recently in the Church of St. Andrea. The central dome would sit on a drum buttressed by a ring of columns, and 4 smaller domes would step down to the 4 corners like Constantine's Apostolion, but more recently like St. Mark's Basilica in Venice and like Ottoman mosques. So Bramante supervised the laying out of the ground foundations, but his project was halted after he and the Pope died in 1513 and 1514 respectively. The new Pope Leo X was equally ambitious. He hired the famous painter and budding architect Raphael Sanzio to fill the role of head architect at St. Peter's. Raphael had actually recently painted the School of Athens, finished in 1511 in the Vatican Palace as a simulation in fresco of the interior of Bramante's St. Peter's. Leo, thinking Raphael understood Bramante's plan well, hired him to continue it. And so Raphael took charge of the construction in 1516, but revised the layout into a longitudinal basilica responding to liturgical critiques. It became a wide space with a nave of 5 bays, including rows of complex apsidal chapels off of the aisles on either side. And so the new St. Peter's began to go up, slowly but surely. And so this renewed project of rebuilding was more ambitious than the last, and there were many opinions about it, namely how the Pope got his fundings. In 1517, very famously, Martin Luther, the instigator of the Protestant Reformation, published his 95 Theses in Germany denouncing the abuses of the papal government. And among his complaints, he signaled out the new project of St. Peter's as an unchristian misuse of papal funds. He says, "Why does the Pope, whose wealth today is greater than the wealth of the richest Crassus, build the Basilica of St. Peter with the money of poor believers rather than with his own money?" But during this period, a war between France and Spain was sparked, and it spilled out onto Italy as it involved some of the Italian republics. And after the especially brutal Battle of Pavia in 1525, large contingents of Spain's armies mutinied. And so German and Swiss mercenaries that the Spanish had hired, many of them Protestants intent on punishing Rome, swept into the city in 1527 and held the city hostage for 9 months. And this sack of Rome unleashed an artistic diaspora where many budding Renaissance artists and architects fled Rome before and after the sack. And so, for example, Sansovino, this budding papal architect from Rome, fled to Venice and became the state architect, bringing a classical revival to the very medieval picture-perfect Gothic city. And for the Library of San Marco, his greatest project, he planned this very classical 3-dimensional facade. The arcades appeared like a flattened version of the arcades of the Colosseum, but with elegantly carved Doric friezes in the lower story and an Ionic one in the upper. Meanwhile, Andrea Palladio fled to Vicenza for work. And his career took off when he won the commission to redesign the Basilica of Vicenza, a medieval council hall which had collapsed in 1496. But Palladio would earn his greatest fame from designing villas on the estates of Venetian nobles. He justified the use of putting a pedimented temple front on a house, reasoning inaccurately though that the ancients derived the temple type from their houses. So for Villa Elmo here, he raised a central block with a temple front between these 2 low arcades stretching out to either side, which terminated in dovecotes for pigeons. Next, Palladio built the Villa Rotunda for a wealthy priest in Venice who had actually been forced to abdicate because of an accusation of homicide, and so he retired to his estate built by Palladio in 1564. This villa was perfectly symmetrical in all directions, where a 6-column Ionic temple front porch radiated on all 4 sides. And at the center of it all, he capped the building with a double-height rotunda and a hemispherical dome. And to use such a form, usually reserved for churches, appeared to comfort Palladio's patron's frustrated career as a priest. But Palladio's villas turned out to be rehearsals for the design of a new type of church, which he experimented with during his final decade of life, where he gained commissions for several churches in Venice. These churches followed the conventional basilica plan, but on the facade on the front, he invented a variation of the classical temple front. Here, he overlaid a very small temple front, framing just the front entrance, just the front door, onto a taller central one and onto a hidden one behind to accommodate the door, facade, and aisles of the basilica much more naturally. Meanwhile, the interior matched the exterior with the same penchant for colossal columns and short pilasters, done in this typical white plaster and gray paint style of the Renaissance classical revival. And finally, he topped the choir with this stilted Ottoman dome and flanking minaret-like champanelles, a nod to, Venice's worldliness and inspired by the mosques at Istanbul, well known by the patron of the church, who was actually good friends with the Grand Vizier of Istanbul. Michelangelo was the third and final Renaissance architect who took over as head architect on St. Peter's Basilica from Raphael after his death. Before this, he became a famous Renaissance architect for his contradictions and creative rule-breaking in classical design, creating an image of Papal Rome that was more unique and less academically inspired than other Renaissance architects. He also took plasticity to new levels. So his first major project here was the new sacristy for San Lorenzo, the oldest church in Florence, the same building which houses the mausoleum for the first Medici dukes. Here, he followed the design scheme of Brunelleschi's old sacristy on the other side of the church, with its gray painted pilasters and pediments on white plaster walls, but with new inventions. He inserted white marble aedicules, or Roman household shrines, between the pilasters for added plasticity and depth. Indeed, every inch of the walls were three-dimensional and sculptural. His rooms dripped with the classical. Shrines, framed windows, and statues burst out of niches in the walls. Michelangelo had a disdain, even a fear of flat, empty space, and this would foreshadow his decorative design of St. Peter's Basilica on the inside and the out. And this fear of flat space can also be seen on Michelangelo's redesign of the Campidoglio in 1537, this post-Roman site of Rome's symbolic continuation of the Roman Senate, whose only power in the city now concerned the budget for the yearly carnival. This was sort of like, you can think of it sort of like Rome's Buckingham Palace, now only symbolic, but very, very still important to the people of Rome. And so Michelangelo essentially transformed it from a series of irregular medieval buildings on an unpaved dirt yard, which you can see in this drawing, into a magnificent ordered kind of outdoor sculpture gallery. To do this, he stripped the medieval buildings to their cores and relined the facades in colossal marble Corinthian pilasters on orange plaster walls with aedicules framing the windows. Then he topped the roofs with balustrades, and in turn topped these with tiny statues of toga-clad ancient Roman senators. And finally, the ancient Roman statue of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius was placed as the centerpiece in the courtyard, and the courtyard tiles were decorated with this starburst pattern. And in the courtyards of these buildings, Brunelleschi actually sheltered Roman statues recently saved from the crumbling ruins of the Roman Forum, including the colossal head and arms of Constantine, which still sit there today. So finally, we return to finish with the completion of St. Peter's Basilica by Michelangelo. So, before too much work had commenced on Raphael's plan, he soon died, as I said, and Michelangelo took it over. And he actually went back and preferred Bramante's original ideas, so he expanded on them, keeping his floor plan, but also keeping Raphael's Basilica Hall now in progress to one side of the central vault. On the outside though, he completely overhauled Bramante and Raphael's plans. He designed the outside to be covered in the same sort of colossal pilasters and aedicules from the Campidoglio that gave so much depth and shadow to the walls. Meanwhile, the planned 42-meter dome, massively stilted like Ottoman domes, required considerable buttressing. Bramante had proposed originally supporting the base with 2 layers of densely packed arcaded piers around the drum, a lot like, the much later US Capitol building. But Michelangelo then noticed that Sinan from the Ottoman Empire had already solved this same problem by using radiating flying buttresses around the dome. So Michelangelo ringed his drum in flying buttresses just like Sinan, only now cleverly hidden behind engaged Corinthian columns to give it a much more classical guise. And to build the dome itself, Michelangelo used the innovations of Brunelleschi's dome in Florence, so he built that double-shelled lightweight dome without supports using those herringbone brick patterns just like at Florence, and held together with 2 sets of stone ribs on the inside of both domes just like in Florence, so that the dome put very little outward stress on the walls. And finally, the dome was topped with a lantern modeled as a miniature version of the dome with colonnaded buttresses at half scale, and this made its completion in 1593. And so this dome enriched the Roman skyline for the first time in centuries and gave Rome a fresh sense of artistic superiority. And this very, confident use of classical architecture really projected the desired professional authority of the Counter-Reformation Catholic Church. Sadly, Michelangelo died before he could see the completion of St. Peter's, but the rest of construction for the core of the church followed his plans. But Michelangelo's touches were not the final touch in the current appearance of the church. In 1614, for example, a very Baroque temple front facade was added, and by the mid-1600s, the great Baroque architect Bernini decorated the interior extensively, beautifying the very simplistic, uncolored Renaissance interior by gilding much of it and adding many, many new ornaments. Bernini also created St. Peter's Square, an extraordinary pincer-shaped double colonnade, mimicking, the original forecourt of Constantine St. Peter's. And so after a century and a half of work and sweat by generations of artists, stonemasons, and architects, St. Peter's Basilica came together in the end to really provide a national style for Rome, Catholicism, and Italy.